Hey friends, welcome back to Thrive and Align Healing Podcast. This is episode 113, and we're talking about ADD and ADHD.
Yes, I think this is a growing topic, right? We talked about how a lot of folks are identifying as ADD and ADHD very regularly. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about the root cause of ADD, ADHD, and how to address it. Okay. So ADD, ADHD is the attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And oftentimes that's a disorder where people suspect they have, whether they've been diagnosed or not, with difficulty concentrating, difficulty like with productivity, like finishing tasks, staying focused, right? And sort of that productivity. I think most of us have probably experienced a little bit of that, here and there. But essentially what we're looking at is a decrease in our neurotransmitters, okay? Specifically the norepinephrine and the epinephrine neurotransmitters. When those neurotransmitters are out of balance or not, our body's not producing them in adequate amounts, we're going to experience trouble with focus, memory, attention, productivity, even learning disorders with that. And norepinephrine and epinephrine are part of our dopamine pathway. So I think we've talked about this in the past, but our body takes the amino acid tryptophan, takes it to dopamine or to L-dopa, dopamine, and then from dopamine to norepinephrine and epinephrine. Mm-hmm. Epinephrine is another name for adrenaline, right? Most of us have heard of adrenaline. Yeah. And dopamine is that reward neurotransmitter, that feel-good neurotransmitter, if you will. And so when we are producing adequate amounts of norepinephrine and epinephrine, usually we're doing pretty good. We don't notice a lot of deficiencies or challenges. The cofactors to producing that norepinephrine and epinephrine in adequate amounts is cortisol and something called SAMe. But we're going to focus on cortisol because if we are experiencing stress, right? Doesn't matter what walk of life, if we are a child, if we're an adult, if we're an elder, and we are experiencing stress, that's going to affect our cortisol, right, amounts. If that demand for stress or that demand for cortisol becomes a chronic issue and our body isn't able to produce adequate amounts of cortisol where it has that resting period, it's going to be very challenging for the cortisol to be present for that norepinephrine to epinephrine pathway to occur.
Yeah.
Follow me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if we don't address the demand for cortisol, that stress that's increasing that cortisol, over time, that cortisol won't be produced in adequate amounts to create that conversion of norepinephrine to epinephrine. Okay. Then we see issues with ADD, ADHD. So when we have kids who are diagnosed with ADD and ADHD, it's the same mechanism. Oftentimes, that those neurotransmitters aren't being produced in adequate amounts, that norepinephrine, epinephrine. So we look and see, okay, well, why are they not being, produced enough? Is it further upstream, like they have a diet that's lower in amino acids and they don't have enough tryptophan available to make that dopamine and the norepinephrine and epinephrine? Is it a trauma or a stress that child has experienced that is limiting that conversion of norepinephrine to epinephrine, that's creating this ADD, ADHD picture? It could still be diet, things like MSG, things like food preservatives, things that are often found in those preservatives that are found in processed food can suppress the enzyme that also produces epinephrine from norepinephrine. So we can kind of be a combination. It's usually those top 4 combinations that create that imbalance in that norepinephrine and epinephrine.
Okay. So to like make it simple,
Yes.
like ADD, ADHD is a neurotransmitter problem.
Yes.
Okay. It is not like a default with your brain. I think that's typically kind of what's presented is like there's something wrong with your brain. It's kind of permanent. You just need to take this medicine for the rest of your life or find these little coping mechanisms with widget things, right?
Fidget spinners. Yeah.
But it's really like, no, it's it is a neurotransmitter, a chemical thing.
Yeah.
And the root causes of this chemical not being produced in adequate amounts, right? Either too low or too high.
Yes.
So there's 3, it sounds like. One of them is possibly genetic and not producing the certain enzyme.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
One of them is possibly diet, that you're not getting these nutrients to convert.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is unprocessed trauma or chronic stress that is tapping in too much in cortisol.
Right. That's affecting those cortisol pathways. Yes.
So are those the 3 root causes that cause the symptoms, right? Because ADD and ADHD are a symptom of an underlying problem.
Exactly. Yes. So, yes, the only other, I guess the 4th one that I'd throw in there is it could still be diet. And it could be those food preservatives that actually suppress that enzyme as well.
Yeah, I think that was one of my mentioned, right?
Okay.
Stress, trauma, 1, 2, diet.
Yes.
3, genetic.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah. So, even as adults, right, we may feel like we're experiencing ADD, ADHD, read about it, and you're like, oh man, all these symptoms sound exactly like me. I have all of these problems. It's still going to be one of those root causes.
Right.
Yeah, it's still going to be the same for a child as it would be for an adult.
Right.
Now, for children, if you're diagnosed, technically you're diagnosed, I think it's less than 7 years old or 9 years old. They often put folks on medications, things like Ritalin or Adderall. Concerta is the other one. Yeah. And those medications work by stimulating that epinephrine, right? So
production of adrenaline.
Exactly. So it promotes that that production of adrenaline. So then the idea is the more adrenaline you have in your body, okay, yes, it's supposed to counteract that hyperactivity, but yes, they could be more focused and pay attention. So then, it's supposed to increase their memory and their learning and that route.
Yeah.
So they are recognizing the dysfunction with those prescriptions because they are like, okay, yes, it's an epinephrine, norepinephrine problem. So let's stimulate that production. Okay. Right. But it's not getting to why that production is off. Right. And that's where addressing the cortisol and the stress is part of the why. It can often be one of the biggest causes of why you're not making enough epinephrine or adrenaline because that cortisol is not present.
So it's really interesting. Like if you're a school teacher and you have a lot of kids with ADD, ADHD, looking at some of these, I think kids like that don't have a very safe, nurturing home. If they're coming out of a home that has chaos, they're constantly stressed.
Yeah.
Right. Kids show stress differently than adults, but it's still very stressful. So not only do they have a very stressful home, they're draining those cortisol stores, which then is making it where their brain can't focus because they can't produce epinephrine or epinephrine at adequate amounts. So now they have behavioral things going on in the classroom.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So then if we don't address that early, right, then it becomes this chronic struggle into young adults, right, and even to adulthood. And you find as adults, whether adults were diagnosed with ADHD or ADD when they were a kid or not, we often find coping mechanisms to balance out, that those symptoms, right?
Yeah, I was telling a client when she was talking about her daughter that's 12, and I will do another podcast on this, on like childhood survival skills. But we as humans will self-medicate if we don't give the tools that we need to help with these survival skills that we've created. We will then find ways to self-medicate.
Yes.
And that may be self-medicating through people pleasing, self-medicating through alcohol, drugs, video games, Netflix, social media, whatever we can do to provide a little bit of dopamine hit for ourselves to feel better.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
So you're exactly right. So we create those habits to feel better. So when I introduced in the beginning, the norepinephrine and epinephrine, those are the biggest players with ADD and ADHD. But upstream from that is dopamine. So if we find ways to self-medicate to kind of pacify that feeling, if you will, we're feeding that dopamine, right? And then your brain says, hey, that felt good, right? Like that made me feel better. So then you create this habit around that, trying to address that ADD and ADHD symptoms by self-medicating.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it may make people feel better, may even make them think that there are, it may even help them increase their productivity or increase their focus.
Yeah, like Adderall does.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that people may find, oh, if I work with a fidget spinner, or if I, do this on the side, it helps me stay focused so I can be present, so I can sit still, so I can be in that meeting, or, like accomplish these tasks that I need to do, or whatever. But it's still not addressing the root cause.
Right. It's still self-medicating in a way.
Right. Yeah. I think it's helpful to understand that relationship and what's actually going wrong and where we can correct it. Because for some folks, as you find ways to self-medicate, well, you may get to a point where that doesn't work as well anymore.
Right.
Right. And then you're kind of floundering, trying to find something else.
Right.
And you're like, oh, okay, well, this is working for a while. And then when that doesn't, raise your dopamine and help to address those feelings or help you focus, then you're on to something else, right? And like you're always going after or trying to find something to help, balance that out. But you're not getting to the root cause. So it's always, maybe not always changing, but you'll get to a point where you'll be like, this isn't working for me anymore. It's not doing what I, need it to do.
Yep. And I think it's only, especially for kids, it's only fair. Like, let's get to the root cause. Let's help you out so you don't have to struggle with this for the rest of your life.
Right.
Which that is very counter to what conventional medicine says. Like, you're just going to struggle with this for the rest of your life.
Yes. And it's that's one of my biggest pet peeves is when they tell folks, this is just you, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is just the way that your body and your brain are built.
Yeah.
Well, the challenge is so if the conventional medicine only has to offer Adderall, Ritalin, and Concerta, and technically those are supposed to be short-term medications, right?
Yeah.
They're not necessarily, they don't do as well, and they follow you into adulthood. Some of the risks of taking those medications for decades can cause other problems, right? Yeah, it can create scenarios and situations that lead to other mood disorders, right? Things. So if you're suppressing, if you're increasing that norepinephrine, epinephrine, and you're always, needing that medication to get that production of epinephrine or norepinephrine, well, that's creating this, it's adrenaline, right? So you're creating this kind of false fight or flight symptom, right? Like this false survival mode. So then you're training your brain to always be on like that,
Okay.
right? So then it's hard to go into that parasympathetic state. You're promoting things like eating disorders because you're decreasing those appetite centers in the brain as well, the more epinephrine and norepinephrine, because your body's creating this like false survival mode.
Yeah.
And so instead of the demand being into the adrenals, now it's in the neurotransmitters, and you're creating this chronic cycle.
Yeah, which I would assume affects your GABA
Yes.
level too.
Yeah, it does. It does.
And then I would assume there's some got to be messing with serotonin, because melatonin is what helps us sleep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So then like you said, so because none of these neurotransmitters are completely independent of everybody else. Right. They all play together. They all work together. So if we have a change in our GABAs are inhibitory, right? If we're not producing enough GABA, oftentimes we see things like that anxiety, right? That can come with that. And so we, work on trying to address, well, if that norepinephrine and epinephrine are out of balance, how can we bring them back into balance, right?
Yeah.
How can we support the body to produce those amounts instead of stimulating them with medications, or even, with our self-medication,
right?
Doing things to kind of, stimulate it on its own.
So can you break down each category, every root cause, and like how you address it?
Okay, yes. So we'll start with the stress piece. So if that norepinephrine and epinephrine are not making in adequate amounts because we don't have enough cortisol available, because of that demand has been high in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to address the adrenal dysfunction. We have to address that cortisol levels, that they are adequate amounts in the body in order to promote that norepinephrine to epinephrine.
Okay.
Move pathway. Okay. If it is something that is genetic, where that PNMT enzyme, just a acronym for really long name, isn't functioning at 100%, it may only be functioning at 70% or 30%.
Mm-hmm.
Say you're a person where you have some polymorphisms that's only functioning at 30%. You can still maximize that 30%, right?
Mm-hmm.
In making sure that you are promoting that whole pathway from tryptophan to dopamine to norepinephrine to epinephrine,
Mm-hmm.
by making sure that you've got all those cofactors present, that you're watching your diet, that you're not eating things that suppress that, like those food preservatives.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can maximize that. The other piece is if you have deficiencies, right? So if you're deficient in tryptophan, if you're deficient in vitamin D, that's still kind of part of the diet piece. If you're deficient in tryptophan or vitamin D, iron, and tryptophan all have to be present in order to start that pathway to go to dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Yeah. So those are different ways you can optimize that. Yeah.
Okay.
There are herbs and things that we can do to support, like increase the blood flow, oftentimes they have some, what we call nervine property in the herbal world, and that nervines help to relax our brain. Okay. They help to kind of relax our body and our mind. And so you think, okay, that's the way that they work, is they're addressing the stress.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So things like ginkgo and gotu kola are usually at the top of the list if you look up natural ways to address ADD and ADHD, because those herbs are nervine and they increase the blood flow to the brain, what we call neurotropics.
Mm-hmm.
And they can be very effective.
Mm-hmm.
But they're addressing that stress, but they're not stimulating the production of norepinephrine and epinephrine. Yeah. So from my perspective, we always have to address the stress, right. Just because that's the most common. Now, like I said, you address the genetic piece as it comes up, you address the diet piece, but usually your biggest bang for your buck is to address that cortisol first. Yeah. And then that will bring up your levels of norepinephrine and epinephrine.
So it's almost like kids or adults, like if there's trauma, like going to someone, processing the trauma, healing from the trauma, and getting the tools you need to move out of the fight or flight into the rest and digest, the parasympathetic system, safety, right?
Yes.
To help start healing the cortisol, but then also you have to approach it from he can come over here, the food, we have a kitty.
Yeah.
Big kitty.
Yeah.
The food side, supplement side, to help make sure the body has the nutrients it needs to make all these things.
Yeah.
B, we're not ingesting nutrients that block the production of these things.
Yeah, that suppress it. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So so I want folks to understand it is easy to address ADD and ADHD. It may not always, it's simple to address, may not always be easy, right? Because we say that like, okay, we address the stress, we address the cortisol, and that it's a journey for folks, right? It's a journey for folks, but recognizing that doing that work and going through that journey will help downstream affect our brain, our ability to focus, memory, learning, attention, our productivity, to do whatever we want to do and achieve those goals in work, family, in business. And so helping folks to see that relationship, I think, is really important, because it can be a challenge when you decide to go that direction or like work on it. And it's like, oh, okay, I could work on it to the point where, I can fix my brain. This isn't something that I have to live with for the rest of my life, or just accept that I'm always going to have these problems, or use it as an excuse of, okay, so I have an ADHD brain or an ADD brain, I'm going to make changes. But I think the challenge is when people have a tendency, now that you have a label for it, is that it becomes this like, oh, this is the norm, I don't need to work on it.
Yes.
Right. Like,
this is like, I have a sixth finger.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. Instead of like, oh, I have a cut on my hand, I need to address the cut, it'll heal, it'll go away. Right. Like, it's like, oh no, I have a cut that I have a cut for the rest of my life.
Right.
It's not integrating it into who you are. It's just currently a symptom of something that's going wrong that we can just address.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's a very different perspective, especially from conventional medicine, and sort of the majority is that great, now you suspect that you've got this diagnosis. It's just something that we live with. That doesn't have to be the case. Right. Yeah, that doesn't have to be the case. Right.
I never had problems focusing until probably until my stress level got so high, and then moved into a chronic stress state, like post flood and domestic violence. Like, I would say 3 years of just living in like high levels of stress. It started like I couldn't focus. It felt like I was like chasing squirrels all the time, and my brain, like rabbit, like shiny object, and I was like, do I have ADD? But then we started addressing my neurotransmitters, and it's like my brain's back to how it was before all that stress, just kind of calm and not a lot of chatter, and I can focus. So I totally believe like that can be addressed.
I can tell when I am overwhelmed, or if I have a really stressful day, I can tell when it's hard for me to focus on a task at hand. Or I notice this too, like when I give talks, and part of this is that cortisol response, but when I'm giving talk, and if like somebody comes in or something changes me, and I like have that, oh, squirrel, there's something over there, it's much harder for me to stay focused and finish the presentation. It takes me a few seconds to like kick back in and figure out where I was, because I'm already following something else, and I'm like, oh, well, yeah, I'm stressed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can see, so you can, once you understand that relationship, you can recognize it instead of being like, oh, that's just my ADHD
Yeah.
brain. That's just my ADD brain. You know, I
Right.
mean, because it is. And I mean, they're right. That is an ADD response. But if we recognize like, oh, there's a little bit of stress there, there's a little bit of overwhelm, right? Or maybe I ate something that I wasn't supposed to, right? That has now lowered my ability to produce that norepinephrine and epinephrine. So then it's kind of producing those set of symptoms.
Yeah. This is a little bit off subject, but it makes me think of like, because my sister-in-law is a teacher. And she had a lot of kids last year that had behavioral problems and a lot of kids that had ADD and ADHD. It's like, oh, and I know it's not the school's responsibility, but to make your job easier, like if the schools could start off the morning with like some breathing exercises, calming music, like, and teaching the kids how to move their body over into parasympathetic. It makes me wonder if that would help their little bodies like move out of fight and flight, move into safety, like Monday through Friday during the day, I can be in safety. And I wonder if that would lower the ADHD symptoms. I mean, I know they're gonna have to go home to stress, but at least in this time, their brains can kind of move over into rest, digest.
Right, because they're creating this safe space. I do. I think that that would be very, very beneficial to them in their school and their learning, but for the teachers in the classroom as well. In other countries, they do that. In other countries, they'll teach kids meditation or breathing exercises first thing in the morning to help them kind of, get that focus and that recenter of like, okay, we're going to slow down and promote that parasympathetic state. Then it's a lot easier for them to digest the material, but to understand and learn a little bit, a little bit more. And so it's promoting, better memory. And so I don't know that all the classrooms in the US value that as much as they do in other countries, which I think is a little bit unfortunate. But I know that there are teachers who are doing their best, and have found things like the fidget spinners to be very beneficial in their classroom. And it's beneficial because they're feeding that part of the brain, but instead of working on the root cause to create that safe space and like slow everybody down, even if it's just like focusing on breathing or finding ways to help them kind of address the stress in their brain so that we're producing those amounts of norepinephrine, epinephrine like we're asking our body to do when you're in school.
Cool. Anything else?
I think that's it.
All right, guys, if you have any questions, definitely
reach out,
email you.
You can email me at info@drcarmenjones.com. That's I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks guys, have a great day.